The autumn of 1968 should have been the season of unqualified triumph for James Marshall Hendrix. The world, viewing him through the vibrant, shifting lens of the late 60s, saw the Jimi Hendrix Experience as the absolute embodiment of artistic freedom, a trio that had not just broken the rules of rock and blues, but had completely redefined the potential of electric sound. Every concert poster, every piece of grainy television footage, every album cover, the thick, heavy cardboard of the vinyl sleeves and the psychedelic artwork, reinforced the public image of a visionary unburdened by earthly constraints, a shaman who spoke the language of pure electricity. Yet, this incandescent public myth stood in catastrophic, cruel opposition to the private, draining reality of the man. For Jimi, the experience was rapidly becoming an incandescent prison, a magnificent, gold-plated cage built not by critics, but by ironclad contracts and crushing, relentless logistics. The actual creation of his sound, a tapestry of complex feedback and spontaneous, demanding improvisation, required immense inner solitude, focus, and physical rest. The reality was a grinding, punishing itinerary designed by his management to extract maximum financial yield following the monumental, unrepeatable success of Are You Experienced and Axis, Bold as Love. He was no longer James Marshall Hendrix, the searching, guitar-obsessed artist. He was the property, the central, indispensable engine of a global economic machine. The touring schedule of late 1968 was a logistical atrocity, a continuous series of one-nighters demanding supersonic travel across different time zones, cultural environments, and legal jurisdictions, often within a grueling 48-hour window. This brutal, mechanical pace created the perfect storm for dependency and deep exhaustion. The artist's mind, constantly buzzing with creative ideas and tormented by profound, isolating performance anxiety, demanded a chemical ceasefire. The adrenaline high of a show was inevitably followed by a crushing, deep-seated psychological and physiological crash. The industry-standard solution, normalized in the high-pressure environment of the late 60s rock scene, was a dangerous pharmacological seesaw. Heavy stimulants, often amphetamines, were necessary to force the energy needed for the stage, and copious amounts of alcohol and strong sedatives were essential to silence the constantly buzzing, tortured creative mind afterward, to secure a few hours of mandated sleep before the cycle began again. This chemical dependency became a necessity born not of personal weakness, but of professional obligation to the machine. The world knew Jimi Hendrix as the explosive, endless source of musical energy, but behind the dazzling mask, he was a young man being systematically worn down, his spirit slowly dissolving under the constant pressure of expectation and the tyranny of the commercial clock. The European leg of the tour in the fall of 1968 was a grueling, unforgiving circuit, a blur of cold German, anxious Scandinavian, and demanding French cities, orchestrated by managers who appeared criminally oblivious to the concept of human fatigue. The constant demand for the spectacle, especially after the fame of the burning guitar stunt at Monterey, intensified the underlying performance anxiety. Every cancelled show meant not just lost revenue, but debilitating contractual penalties, threatening the fragile financial stability of the entire operation. This pressure cooker environment found its tragic peak in a specific, dark night in an anonymous German city, a night that was intended to be just another profitable tick mark on the calendar but instead became a horrifying, near-fatal display of collapse under extreme pressure. This incident, meticulously documented in the private road diaries of the crew, was a full-scale systemic failure that revealed the lethal, consuming indifference of the business machine. But then, in London on that last fateful night, as years of hidden recordings and fragmented testimonies finally began to surface, the story transformed into something far larger than just Jimi's tragic end. It became an indictment of the commercial system that not only permitted but actively cultivated the conditions for the premature deaths of its most brilliant young figures. The other musicians and road personnel, who witnessed the slow physical disintegration, later began to describe the horrific scene backstage that night, a moment of stark, terrifying vulnerability that stood in chilling contrast to the blazing, indomitable image the world demanded. 3 hours before the scheduled German concert, Jimi's absence from the dressing room was noted with increasing urgency. When the crew finally gained entry to his quarters, a small, poorly ventilated space often barely better than a storage closet, they were met not with the sight of a man preparing for glory, but with a scene of utter, frightening incapacitation. He was not tuning his guitar, he was found collapsed in a corner, surrounded by the physical evidence of a severe physiological breakdown, the painful convergence of utter exhaustion, alcohol, and the heavy sedatives he used to manage his crippling anxiety. 100,000 fans might be cheering for the man who promised transcendence, who embodied the 60s dream, but in the narrow corridor backstage, Jimi would stand, cigarette burning, asking the same question over and over, "Can I just stop now? Is there an exit from this contract, from this body?" The machine had truly seized up, and the engineers were scrambling, not for medical help, but for a crude, immediate restart button. This was the moment his dependency stopped being functional and became a terminal vulnerability. The silence in the German backstage was a heavy, suffocating blanket, thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation, more potent and terrifying than any feedback scream Jimi could conjure. The inner circle, the road manager, the closest sound technicians, and the bandmates, realized instantly that this was beyond mere fatigue, this was a severe physiological and psychological crisis, a collapse driven by the lethal infusion of fame and chemical dependency. The overriding, instant concern was not the star's vital signs, but the contract. Canceling the show was not simply an option, it was a disaster. The resulting financial penalties, the potential lawsuits from local promoters, and the catastrophic public relations event of shattering the illusion of invincibility were deemed unacceptable by the management hierarchy. The immediate priority was crude resuscitation. The health of the human commodity was strictly secondary to the guarantee of the night's ticket sales. The guitar was no longer just the instrument of Jimi's freedom, it had become part of a silent, consuming cycle that was slowly depleting his body and his memory, a magnificent, beautiful vessel being drained to keep the spectacle moving at all costs. The pressure was compounded by the fact that the contract contained a clause allowing the manager to hold Jimi personally responsible for the costs of cancellation, a chain of debt that was deliberately designed to be inescapable. What unfolded in that cramped, overheated room was a desperate, improvised ritual, a scene of chaotic, non-medical intervention, a practice common in the high-pressure world of rock tours. There were no doctors present, only terrified colleagues and an immense sense of dread. Accounts detail the crude use of ice and cold water, loud psychological coercion, and the reckless administration of whatever stimulants were available, an agonizing attempt to force the inert body to obey the commercial clock. The trusted road crew, who held deep personal loyalty to Jimi the man, were forced into an agonizing, moral compromise. They had to participate in the terrifying act of reanimating their friend for the financial benefit of a manager who was safely hundreds of miles away. This episode left a permanent emotional scar on the crew, who felt complicit in the sacrifice of the artist for the preservation of the myth, fueling a silence that lasted for decades out of fear of repercussions and guilt. Years later, a studio engineer, who witnessed the chilling scene after flying in for a brief consultation, would admit that the one sentence Jimi whispered after they finally got him to his feet still woke him up from a sound sleep, years after his death. The phrase, simple, broken, and utterly defeated, went far beyond physical pain. "I can't feel the music anymore. It's just noise, and I'm the one making it." This was the profound collapse of the artist. The creative well was poisoned, replaced by the mechanical, scheduled demand for profitable output. The feeling of profound alienation from his own talent, of being an animated puppet whose legendary hands were now operating under the dictates of his financial overseers, was the ultimate psychological cost of his stardom. He was desperate for a lifeline, a moment of real human connection to ground him. The love letters written by one of the women who drifted in and out of his life, a silent, paper communication in the chaos, slid under his door during the darkest days of his career, a fragile lifeline of genuine human connection he often couldn't grasp, overshadowed by the brutal demands of the road that kept him perpetually rootless and isolated, unable to form lasting bonds. This sense of profound isolation only deepened his reliance on chemical release. As the scheduled stage time arrived, the tension was unbearable, thick with the stench of sweat, perfume, and fear. Jimi, barely able to stand, was dressed in his signature Moroccan velvet and beads. Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell were ready, aware only of the escalating panic and the urgent need for a distraction. The management's ultimate fear was not just a cancelled show, but a total, irreversible public collapse that would shatter the lucrative image forever. The decision was made with ruthless pragmatism: the show must go on, even if the star was barely conscious. The financial risk of stopping was deemed worse than the human risk of continuing. Pushed onto the stage, a man barely functional, still reeling from the crude backstage intervention, Jimi presented the vast German audience with the physical shell of the rock deity, devoid of the divine fire. The stage lights, normally a source of life and energy for him, seemed harsh and accusatory, illuminating the terrifying fragility of the facade. The crowd's initial roar quickly faded into a confused, nervous murmur. The usual visceral thrill was replaced by a profound uncertainty that seemed to emanate directly from the star himself. The sound was there, the high volume, the signature wah pedal squeals, the sheer volume of the Marshall stacks, but the energy, the invention, the spontaneous genius that defined Jimi Hendrix was catastrophically missing. He struggled visibly through the first few blues numbers, songs he could normally play in his sleep. The solos, which were typically cascading waterfalls of complex, emotional invention, became fragmented, hesitant, and deeply awkward. His voice was weak, his timing erratic. He fumbled notes, missed cues, and, most damningly, failed to engage with the audience or his bandmates. He stood there, a brilliant light dimmed, a shadow mimicking the motions of the legendary performer, desperately trying to remember the choreography of his own genius. The audience, having paid to witness transcendence, was left watching a slow, painful act of disintegration. This wasn't the sound they heard crackling on their analog systems at home. This was the sound of a beautiful machine breaking down in real time, the audible evidence of a spirit being consumed by the commercial imperative. The moment that became the stuff of dark legend, often spoken of in hushed tones among musicians of the era, occurred mid-set. During an extended instrumental passage, which was usually his moment of greatest freedom and improvisation, Jimi suddenly went silent. His guitar hung from his shoulder, producing nothing but dead air. He stared out into the massive, expectant audience, not with the typical hypnotic, penetrating intensity, but with a distant, vacant expression that chilled those in the front rows. The music had stopped, but the lights were still blazing, holding him in the spotlight. He then simply walked off the stage, mid-song, abandoning his instrument and his bandmates without a word. He did not smash the Stratocaster or offer a theatrical bow, he simply left, a man physically exiting a contract he could no longer fulfill, a final, desperate act of silent rebellion against the tyranny of command and the expectations of the crowd. The crowd's reaction shifted dramatically from confusion to anger, culminating in loud, frustrated jeers and scattered disorder. The silence that followed the sudden end of the music was profound and deeply accusatory. Backstage, the ensuing fallout was seismic. Promoters were demanding immediate financial retribution and compensation. Jimi's manager, upon hearing the news, was incandescent with rage, viewing the physical collapse not as a medical emergency, but as a deliberate act of professional betrayal, a threat to his entire global operation. On the back pages of the record company agreements were clauses that no one in the industry ever wanted to read aloud, clauses that allowed managers to fine, control, and penalize artists for poor performance, treating physical collapse as willful insubordination and cementing the total, final lack of autonomy over his own body and career. The manager's dictated solution was immediate and brutal, not rest or rehabilitation, but the immediate scheduling of a new, free concert in a nearby city to cure the catastrophic PR disaster and cover the financial losses. The answer to physical collapse was not compassion, but the unrelenting pressure of more work, the relentless tightening of the screw. His confession to his closest confidants about a long-hidden childhood memory was, in reality, the true starting point of his emotional breakdown, suggesting that the overwhelming pressure of the stadium stage, amplified by dependency, triggered unresolved, fundamental anxieties from his past, making the collapse both inevitable and tragically necessary for his psychic survival. The German incident served as the most explicit, unheeded warning sign in Jimi Hendrix's brief, blazing career. It confirmed to him that the experience, as a fixed structure, was part of his prison. This catastrophic night directly fueled his determination to break up the trio shortly thereafter in early 1969, an act of desperate artistic self-preservation to regain some semblance of creative control, forcing a temporary pause in the relentless pace. He believed the demanding, tight structure of the trio sound was part of the rigid conformity he had fought so hard to escape throughout his life, dating back to his time in the military. He sought radical artistic reinvention, first with the experimental band of Gypsies, a group that allowed him to explore a more raw, rhythmic, electric blues, moving deliberately away from the expected psychedelic spectacle. Crucially, the massive, costly undertaking of Electric Lady Studios in New York was meant to be his ultimate sanctuary, his only viable escape route from the European tour circuit and the debilitating control of his London management. He poured his remaining energy and future earnings into building an anti-barracks where he could be his own commander-in-chief, dictating the schedule, the sound, and the final cut. Yet, the brutal, tragic irony was that the enormous debt incurred by building Electric Lady only forced him back onto the road in 1970, further intensifying the cycle of exhaustion and dependency that had caused the German collapse. He had built a perfect creative haven, a symbol of ultimate freedom, but the financial tether attached to it was longer and stronger than ever before, guaranteeing a tragic relapse into the cycles of pressure he despised. The fear and exhaustion that culminated in that German collapse never truly left him. They became the constant background static to his final, brilliant, and ultimately doomed attempts to create his fourth album. He knew the collapse was coming again. The relentless schedule of the final, desperate European tour of 1970 was merely a countdown to zero, a grim, calculated race against time. That single final night, 2 years later in London, would prove to be a breaking point that would forever change how the rock music industry viewed the artist and the physical toll it took on their being, forcing a global conversation about the human cost of spectacle and profit. When Jimi finally died in London in September 1970, the official cause was registered as an accident, a simplistic label for a catastrophic systemic failure. Those who remembered the German collapse understood the deeper, more complex truth. He died from a profound, systemic exhaustion that had been building for years, an exhaustion fueled by relentless work, legal battles, and the basic inability to be granted rest and autonomy by the business. The fear and exhaustion visible in Jimi's eyes, captured forever in the grainy documentary footage from those final tours and the haunting silence of the unfinished tapes, spurred his loyal fans to ask the essential, painful question, once he left the stage, who was truly protecting him from the system that was consuming him? The legacy of that terrifying night in Germany is a potent one. It forces the nostalgic audience, those who revered the myth, to confront the cold, devastating reality of the machine that created it. The brief, aborted German concert was not a failure of talent, but a catastrophic failure of protection and responsibility. Jimi Hendrix was a genius who was driven to the brink, a brilliant light that burned too hot, too fast, and was ultimately extinguished by the very industry that celebrated his brilliance. His story is a powerful, sorrowful reminder that he needed human care, rest, and autonomy. The system, relentlessly, gave him another tour bus ticket. The quiet, introspective music he left behind, the scattered acoustic tracks and the complex, soulful sketches, are the final, haunting echoes of the man who walked off stage, searching for a peace the world refused to provide. The immediate weeks following the German fiasco were defined by a period of agonizing emotional and artistic reckoning for Jimi Hendrix. The press, quickly contained by the management machine, dismissed the rumors as either a technical failure or star capriciousness. Yet, the small, internal circle knew this was a profound turning point. Jimi had been physically rescued, but his artistic confidence had been dealt a severe blow. His whispered confession that he couldn't feel the music on stage was not just a symptom of physical fatigue, but the painful admission of the chasm that had opened between his boundless creativity and his debilitating commercial obligations. This incident intensified the complex, deeply toxic relationship with his manager, Michael Jeffrey. Jeffrey was, first and foremost, a businessman, a financial operative, Jimi's boundless potential was simply a primary revenue stream for him. Jeffrey's typical reaction to such crises was not empathy, but incandescent rage and suspicion, coupled with the immediate authoritarian solution of simply demanding more work. His relentless, commanding schedule and controlling demeanor were a painful echo of the control mechanism Jimi had learned to despise during his army days at Fort Campbell. Jimi had successfully run away from the government's control, but he was now the prisoner of a larger, more colorful military operation run by his own manager, who possessed a terrifying level of contractual authority. This profound psychological pressure began to corrupt Jimi's sacred relationship with his instrument. In earlier, purer days, the guitar was an extension of his soul, a tool for infinite discovery and improvisation. But by late 1968, the Fender Stratocaster had ceased to be a simple symbol of freedom. It was a required weapon for a theatrical display, a mandatory component of a spectacle that had to be repeated perfectly, night after night. Fans constantly demanded the fire they saw at Monterey, the sonic warfare they heard at Woodstock. This relentless expectation choked Jimi's genuine creative impulse. When he desperately needed quiet time to simply sit and explore a new chord structure or a new tone, the phantom voice of Jeffrey was perpetually in his ear. When will we generate revenue? Where is the next marketable hit? The acoustic demos and private recordings Jimi made during this immediate aftermath, often capturing in a single take on a simple tape recorder, offer the most intimate insight into this internal conflict. Retreating from the volume, the overwhelming physical force of the Marshall stacks, he sought refuge in the raw, unadorned sound of wood and string. These recordings, unlike the massive, extroverted chaos of the Experience era, were strikingly introverted, melancholic, and deeply searching. This was the pure sound of an artist attempting to outrun the expectations of his fans and the relentless demands of his management. The collapse in Germany became the definitive catalyst for Jimi's decision to dissolve the Experience. He held no personal blame for Noel Redding or Mitch Mitchell, but he felt the very fixed, three-person structure of the band was part of the cage that suffocated his boundless, genre-defying musical future. The breakup was an act of desperate flight, once again, an escape from a system. But the cost of this escape was immense: greater loneliness, profound artistic uncertainty, and the immediate intensification of the legal struggles against the restrictive early contracts. The stage in Germany was not merely a venue, it was a battleground where he had, in his mind, dropped the flag of his artistic freedom. Moving into 1969, Jimi Hendrix's visceral need to escape the constraints of touring crystallized into a monumental, tangible project, Electric Lady Studios. This studio, planned for the heart of New York's Greenwich Village, was conceived not just as a recording facility, but as his ultimate psychological and artistic sanctuary, an anti-barracks designed to be entirely free from commercial deadlines, the tyranny of touring schedules, and, most crucially, the pervasive shadow of Michael Jeffrey's managerial control. His dream was simple yet radical: to record on his own terms, at his own pace, seeking his sound without constant pressure. Electric Lady was intended to be the place where Jimi would finally be his own commander-in-chief. Rooted in his experience as a former soldier, he believed that true discipline and creativity must originate internally, not through external command. Even the studio's radical architectural design and its unique acoustic properties, its sound isolation, its specialized lighting, the colors chosen for the mixing room, were meticulously crafted to filter out the chaos of the outside world and accommodate the vast, sensitive complexity of Jimi's sonic universe. It was his ultimate, physical declaration of artistic independence. However, the cost of this dream led to a devastating, tragic irony. The immense construction costs of Electric Lady Studios, a vast, multi-million-dollar investment in the late 60s, immediately chained Jimi more tightly to the very commercial machine he was trying to flee. The studio became his single largest debt. The only viable path to pay off this colossal obligation was to return to the road, relentlessly, playing the exact kind of exhausting, high-pressure tours that had led to the collapse in Germany. The intended sanctuary, the ultimate escape route, became a new, heavier financial shackle. This immense financial pressure, however, did not extinguish the artistic vision of his new groups, like Band of Gypsies, with Buddy Miles and Billy Cox. This group represented a profound, necessary attempt to return to his deep funk and R&B roots, a deliberate act of shedding the white psychedelic baggage of the Experience myth. Yet, even with this artistically renewed lineup, the signs of extreme fatigue and inconsistency continued to plague his live performances throughout 1969 and 1970. The 1970 final European tour was, in hindsight, a slow-motion suicide mission. The studio's crushing debt, the constant demand for payment, was the invisible manager, the perpetual voice of command that forced him onto the stage despite his clear illness, his exhaustion, and his escalating struggle with dependency. This tour was a direct, repeated echo of the crisis faced in Germany. The geography was different, but the unbearable pressure was identical. Jimi's concerts during this period grew increasingly sporadic, disjointed, and often marked by a frustrated, weary anger. His music was no longer simply a shout of cosmic joy, it was the fatigued roar of a rebellion aimed directly at the system that owned his future earnings. The psychological repercussions of the German collapse left permanent scars on Jimi Hendrix's artistic and personal landscape. The theme of resistance to authority was no longer just a flamboyant stage posture, it became the central, raw trauma of his identity. Every contractual obligation, every forced tour date, resonated with the involuntary control and the threat of imprisonment he had faced during his brief, painful service at Fort Campbell. For his generational cohort, the tragic narratives of their lost idols, Hendrix, Joplin, Morrison, were not just musical tragedies, but a profound cultural statement on the ultimate, often fatal, cost of resisting the monolithic forces of the system. Jimi's personal isolation deepened profoundly. Despite being the world's most celebrated guitarist, he felt utterly unseen, a perpetual outsider whom no one truly understood. His dependency on alcohol and pills served not only as a functional tool to manage extreme physical fatigue but as a desperate coping mechanism to numb the chronic anxiety, the profound loneliness, and the stress created by the endless, escalating legal battles. He was an artistic genius, a revolutionary talent, yet he was still, fundamentally, a poor young man from Seattle wrestling with the ghosts of abandonment and the crushing weight of insurmountable financial obligation. In his final months, the people around Jimi were sharply divided into two factions, the genuine friends and loyalists who desperately sought to protect him and secure his rest, and the commercial stakeholders whose sole focus was maintaining the relentless schedule. This final part of the story evolves from a musical biography into a chilling, devastating portrait of a victim surrounded by predators and enablers. The German incident was a clear warning to his friends, but it was viewed by the commercial sector as simply a point of vulnerability, a flaw that necessitated even tighter, more rigid contractual control. Jimi's final studio work revealed a dramatic shift away from the grand, cosmic soundscapes of the Electric Ladyland era. There was a discernible move toward simpler, deeper, more root-based structures, an agonizing return to the blues. This was the sound of an artist trying desperately to shed his own mythology and simply speak through the strings. His experiments with acoustic guitar and stripped-down arrangements represented his final, desperate escape attempt, to retreat from the deafening clamor and remain solely with his own, quiet voice. He was, through his music, both a warrior and a prophet, yet, his own body and soul were brutally crushed under the weight of this impossible dual role. Walking off the stage in Germany was an act of profound spiritual exhaustion as much as artistic defiance. I cannot take this burden anymore. But the machine refused to hear the cry, it heard only the receipts, the contracts, and the starting time of the next concert. The ultimate tragedy of Jimi Hendrix's death on September 18, 1970, was its predictability. It stands as the final, inevitable consequence of the collapse witnessed 2 years earlier in Germany. Though officially ruled an accident, the underlying truth points to years of systemic exhaustion, financial bondage, and professional negligence. He did not die merely from a chemical overdose, he died from the relentless obligation imposed by the commercial structure that had defined and exploited his talent. The German collapse had been the clearest, loudest warning the industry received, yet that warning was drowned out by the noise of financial ambition. Jimi's lasting legacy is not just the incredible, searing sounds he created. His legacy is also the tragic Ibret Vesikasi, cautionary tale, that permanently changed the relationship between the artist and the industry. His story became a definitive, painful lesson for successive generations of musicians, teaching them that protecting their personal well-being and maintaining control of their masters were ultimately more important than any fleeting moment of stardom. The tapes recovered from the chaos of Electric Lady and various European studios confirmed the creative depth and artistic maturity Jimi had achieved in his final period. These recordings, unburdened by the demand for commercial singles, revealed an artist moving towards a deeper, more soulful, funk rock evolution, a world away from the initial psychedelic boom. He was on the verge of completing the artistic escape he had initiated by walking off the stage in Germany. Jimi Hendrix's tragic narrative resonates so powerfully with the 45 to 60 age demographic because it mirrors the ultimate struggle, the fight for individual freedom against institutional control. He captured the spirit of an age, but was ultimately consumed by the system that commodified that very spirit. The night in Germany was a moment of profound physical collapse, but it stands eternally as a powerful monument to a genius's last, weary, yet utterly honorable resistance against the force that created and ultimately destroyed him. Today, when we drop the needle onto one of his classic analog vinyl records, we are not just listening to rock history's greatest guitarist. We are hearing the sorrowful ballad of a soul who fought fiercely for freedom and was ultimately extinguished by the very price demanded for that freedom. He achieved the silence he desperately craved only in his final, irreversible rest.